everyone, and welcome back. This week's video, I am finally getting into a project that I have wanted to do for years, taking on the concept of 18th century elastic. Yes, I know, if you watched my video last week, you may remember that rubber elastic wasn't really common as a textile elastic until the 1840s. So what were they doing in the 18th century? The answer is tiny metal springs, which is just absolutely amazing. Yes, they had other elasticated sort of things. Things could be knit and have an elastic nature. Leather is very stretchy and bounces back, but specifically elastic garments, elasticated garments, used tiny little metal springs. And it's just mind-blowingly amazing. And I have always wanted to understand better how these actually functioned and felt, and where you could actually find this sort of technology being used. But before we get into that, I want to take a moment to thank my sponsor for this week, Magellan TV. Magellan TV is a new video streaming service that focuses on documentaries. Their library of options is full of historical content from ancient to modern day, not to mention science, space, nature, and even dinosaurs. If you're always looking to explore something new, then this is the perfect place for you. Many of my videos focus on understanding the origins and history behind different objects, so it's no surprise that I was excited to watch Precision, the Measure of All Things. The show explores the history and future of measurements from grains to wavelengths and beyond. Did you know that we used to measure length based on a king's arm, and it changed with every king? Now we're looking to find universal ways to measure weight by counting atoms in a ball of silicone. It really puts my quilting ruler to shame. But Magellan TV's library is growing rapidly, and I am always finding new titles to add to my watch list, faster than I can manage to watch them all. There are no ads, and it's clear that every video was carefully chosen by a team who is passionate about these topics. So go check it out now. Click the link below to get your first month free, and you'll be discovering all that Magellan TV has to offer instantly. Again, thank you to Magellan TV for sponsoring this video. Now, spring elastic. Where can you find it? It is in the weirdest and most interesting places. I have seen it not only in elastic corsets that could be undergarments or outer garments. I have also come across it in elastic garters, which makes perfect sense, something that helps to keep your stockings up. We use elastic garters in the early 20th century, so coming up with an earlier version of it in the 18th century makes sense. I've also come across elastic waistcoats, where it seems to be the strap that goes across the back of the waistcoat that would normally buckle can also have elastic in it, so that way it has a little bit more snugness and hold to the body better. And there's even the satire of a pair of elastic breeches, which at first I thought perhaps were knit breeches, but when you look at the back, it actually specifies spring elastic. This gentleman is going through some difficulties. I don't know if the springs are just in the waistband and the knee bands, where it would be logical, or if they're implying that the whole thing has little springs woven throughout it, which would just be an absolutely intense pair of breeches to put on. Like, more so than a pair of jeans with Lycra that are a little too tight. That is a lot to deal with. So I don't know what's going on in this image, but I am incredibly fascinated with it. But I'm going to start with something a little bit more practical, that of the elastic corset. Small bodices seem to be very popular in fashion at this point in time, and it's no surprise that they tried to sort of take it to the next level with something that was as inventive and interesting as this sort of elastic. Now, these corsets could be for undergarments. There are definitely examples that look like undergarments. There are drawings that seem to imply it being worn as an undergarment, but there are plenty of surviving examples which are clearly not undergarments. They are made out of colorful silks, which would be visible underneath the sheer gowns of the time. They are made out of gauzy sheer fabrics with all sorts of decorative ribbon work on it. It's not going to be for an undergarment. That thing is not going to offer support. So that means some of these were worn externally. Some of these were worn as bodices, as decorative pieces. And that is what I wanted to make today. I decided to go with this particular example. I really liked the simplicity of the design. It seemed like it would be fairly easy to fit, adjust on the body, and it would therefore possibly fit a number of different people, which I thought was a really great idea. And I figured this would also be fairly quick to make up, which it was. I also found a similar example that is listed by a BT on Teachy, and this particular one is very, very similar. So the brown one, the only major differences I could see is that the rectangular pieces that make up the main body before we get to the front, the not elasticated pieces, have a little bit of curve and shape to them, that the straps crisscross in the back, and that the front closure is done by way of lacing rather than the straps and buckles. I ended up using both as reference because there are some images that are a little more clear on one than the other, and unfortunately both sets of images are not very high quality. I couldn't zoom in really far, so there's only so much I could glean from those. And the other examples that I could find where I could zoom in really far had dramatically different construction techniques. One was a single layer of silk, so it didn't have a lining, and it definitely had a different construction method for that reason. And so I had to sort of make some educated guesses on how the exact construction on this garment went, but they're all based off of the way things were constructed in that era, so it shouldn't be that complicated. We're literally just talking about rectangles here. Nothing too crazy. So I used all of these as sort of a reference point for how the construction needed to go together, how the shape needed to be done, and then the angles and the connection points and the overall dimensions had to be done by sort of measuring and checking on my body. The only thing that I found that I absolutely could not accomplish that the green elasticated corset had is the fact that the buckles on it are not just regular slide buckles like I can easily find today. They are the types of buckles that would have had a few prongs. So not unlike shoe buckles or anything else, they actually have some very narrow, very pointy, and very sharp prongs on the middle bar that goes across. I can sometimes find a couple antiques here or there, but finding a set of 5 matching ones in the size and style that I need is not gonna happen. The odds of that are very slim, and it's not really worth my time or money trying to accomplish that. So I ended up going with regular slide bar ones. This creates a problem in the fact that those don't actually offer resistance, and that will be an issue across the front since theoretically this is elasticated. It should be pulled a little snugly on the body. I assume the elastic is there for a reason, and it's not just for effect, otherwise you could gather up those panels. This meant that there are a few ways that I can deal with that, and I will talk a little bit about that when I go to try things on and wear it in the final version, but that's the one place I had to deviate from the original just because of what is or is not available. Otherwise, it's super simple. The springs are something that is available commercially still today. The ones that I'm using are a little bit bigger than the original ones. That just means I have fewer little channels to go down, but they will offer a fairly similar resistance. The textiles, I went with a linen for the lining and then a silk satin, which I actually used the wrong side of, so it looks like a taffeta on the outside, for the exterior part of the bodice, and that's really all there is. It's a very, very simple shape, a very simple construction, and it's a very adjustable garment in the end, so it's a really practical, fun piece to add to something of this era and either really ramp up your ensemble or a plain white dress, or maybe offer a little bit of extra support. In my case, the gown that I made doesn't make it easy for me to put items underneath of it for support, but I can put an external corset on for some extra support. So that seems like a great idea to me. I'm really excited to get to actually try this garment out in the near future. And honestly, I also want to figure out how to incorporate this into my modern wardrobe because it's really darn cute. I didn't make a pattern for this corset as the entire thing is made up of rectangles. The first set of rectangles I have to deal with are all of these straps. They're just an inch wide, and so I just cut a few 2-inch wide strips so that way I had 1/2-inch seam allowance on both edges. The main body I made in 2 pieces that were almost large enough to wrap all the way around my bust, knowing that I would have the elastic panels in front as well. And those were cut to end up being around 4 inches tall. As for the spring panels, I'm guesstimated about how wide those needed to be to get across the bust area and about how tall I wanted them to be, and then added a couple extra inches both ways just to be safe. I wasn't exactly sure how much fabric I wanted gathered up onto the springs, nor how much the bulk of the springs would take up vertically, so adding some extra and trimming it down as I go seemed like a much better choice. The interior portion of the corset is going to be made out of a white linen. The main body portions are cut with the same seam allowance as the silk, but the straps and the section for the springs is actually cut without the extra seam allowance. So you need the same length, but you don't want the 1/2-inch seam allowance along the edges. I then went to mark out all of the stitching channels for the springs on the linen. I didn't want to mark out on the silk just in case I decided to move the channels later if I had them too large or too small. I checked according to the springs how wide they needed to be, I think, we'll double check later, and then added a small 1/16 of an inch space in between each one of the channels. I'll have slightly fewer channels than the original because my springs are just a little bit bigger. The top edge of the silk then gets rolled over. It's folded 1/4 inch and then 1/4 inch of again over on top of the linen and then running stitched down along that top edge. The very top of the fold also gets running stitched, and this will essentially create the first channel for the spring that I need. You just have to make sure that the spacing is correct depending on the size of springs you're using. I noticed that they seem to use a running stitch and not a back stitch or something that takes a lot more time and is a lot more sturdy on the originals, and that honestly makes sense. This isn't going to get a ton of wear and tear. Most of the tension is not going to be a vertical issue, it's horizontal. I also wanted to make sure that I was doing the right length of channels, not just the right width, so I went ahead and tested out one spring in the top channel, seeing how much fabric I wanted to push and gather onto it, so that way I would know the length of the channels and make sure before I went and stitched everything else that I was doing the right width. After getting far enough along that I thought I had enough channels, I double-checked with the springs in the channels how much shorter that made it, and decided how much of the extra to trim away. From there, the very last channel will be done just like the first one, where the edge of the silk is folded over 1/4 inch, and then 1/4 inch again, so that way we're up against the edge of the linen, and we now have a nice finished rolled edge that will also become the channel. As for the springs themselves, they are held into place with some tacking stitches around the loop at the ends. Now, if you got a full straight length of some sort of spring and you need to cut them to proper length, you'll just need to bend over one of the loops at the end to end up with that ring there that you can stitch through and anchor everything down with. I did this all along one edge and then pushed the fabric back and gathered it up over the springs, not unlike trying to push boning through a corset. The actual placement of the wrinkles and gathers will spread out with time. Every time I stretch it, it will sort of compact back in a more spread out way, but for right now I'm less concerned with making the wrinkles pretty and more concerned with making sure that everything is anchored properly. The main body of the corset, I'm just going ahead and folding back the seam allowance that I think I'm going to need to fold back for the silk and for the linen as well, and I'll baste the whole thing together. I'm not stitching any of the edges. I'm not confident that any of them are correct. I might need to adjust the top edge depending on the exact shaping that occurs in the back, because there is a little bit of shaping there. I want to also make sure that this is coming out the same width as the spring section. And I need to add straps. It just seemed really complicated to assume anything about these panels before I tried everything on and made sure that the placement of all the pieces were correct. So for right now, I'm just folding back the edges and basting everything together. This means that it's going to be strong enough to hold up in the fittings, and it's not going to have the edges continue to fray. Other than that, it's just temporary. For the center front, the springs are essentially going to be bound in a way. The strip of silk that I'm using is the same width that I was using for all the straps. I'm just going to cut that to the correct length. I'm not trying to pull the vertical part of the spring panel taut. It sort of gathers up slightly because of the bulk of the springs, and that's fine. I don't want this to be any taller than it already is. I like the height of it, and I don't need to yank that and pull it out. The binding is just going to cover about 1/2 inch at the edge, front and back, fold in the ends so it's nice and clean, and then everything gets felled down. I am only stitching through that top layer of textile when it comes to running over the springs. I don't want to get my thread caught up in the springs. Same thing goes with stitching the back. Then I have to do all the little tabs and straps. These tabs are what's going to hold the buckles on. Super simple, really tiny. The linen is cut to the final measurements, and just like the spring panel, fold over the silk twice, catch it down with a felling stitch. In this case, that only goes through the linen. I don't want the stitches to be visible on the exterior. The original seems to be done this way, does not have visible stitches on the exterior, but you do get the added strength of the linen, which is really nice. When it comes to dealing with the end of the straps, it gets a little bit complicated. They are curved, so I go ahead and cut the curve into the linen portion, but when it comes to working down the silk and folding it over that complex curve, it's not that easy. I like to anchor a few pins in first at the center point and at the sides, and then try and fold it over, making the wrinkles even. So if you put in enough pins, you can work down those wrinkles, split them in half again, and once we go to actually stitch, I'll just end up with some very tiny little wrinkles around that interior edge. You can also accomplish this by way of putting in a large hand gathering thread around that seam allowance area, but I have a harder time working with that than I do managing to manipulate the textile here with pins and pushing in the little wrinkles as I go and making sure that they are even as I stitch them down. The tabs for the buckles and the straps then just get folded over at the ends and attached down to that front section that is bound on the spring panels. You don't have to finish off the ends of these, you don't have to fold the fabric over in any sort of fancy way. The raw edges of the ends will just be hidden away up against that binding. And then both the straps and the tabs will be stitched down individually around all four edges that meet up with the spring panel. I will just be using a felling stitch for this, like I've been using for a lot of the other pieces. It's a very strong stitch, and it's not fully invisible. You could probably take the effort to do that, but that's less of the concern here. I am more concerned with making sure that it's going to be stable. So around both the short edges, the long interior edge, felling it down to that binding that we put on, and then I move to the exterior, where again I fell down that edge, directly through all of the layers of the buckle, tabs, and straps. The long straps for the shoulders are made in exactly the same way. I just won't bother attaching them until after we've done the fitting and we get closer to the end of the project. Once all of the pieces are as complete as they can be for now, I'll pin everything together. I'm using plenty of pins in this because I don't want to put any stress on the silk satin, which can pull in a permanent way if there's one pin that is taking on more stress than the others. So I'm putting 2 rows of pins along the front, guesstimating the angle and overall size of the panels because it's kind of an odd angle to go around my body, so it's a little complex for me to know exactly what length this needs to be. I am just estimating at this point based off of my bust measurements, and the angle is estimated based off of the images of the original. There's no precise way to do this necessarily, but you have to start somewhere. And we're only looking at straight seams here, so as long as all the pieces are roughly where they need to be, it should be fairly easy for me to adjust during the fitting. Because there's that method, but the moment you pull, it all comes undone. So next method option is instead of going this way where you actually see the whole buckle, come up through, over, and then back under and around. It's kind of complicated to do. I'm not sure how easy this is going to do on a person, but so I do that, then that will hold. Okay, there we go. That makes more sense. So the front is a little bit too big because these are situated, I think, about where they should be. Like, these are pretty darn close. Like, I like where the placement of that is. I think much further back it would start to go too far. So that means I need to move these pieces over. Of course, I put like tons of pins. I gotta be careful of that. Okay, if I change the angle of the back, take it in about an inch at the bottom, that actually feels really snug up until I get to this point. That's much better. I like that feeling. If I just pinch right back there. Okay, so we're gonna adjust for that. I'm going to move the top of this barely over, like maybe 1/4 of an inch, and the bottom I'm gonna move over like maybe not a full inch, but like 1/2 inch. We'll see. Okay, make some small adjustments, try it back on again. All right, I adjusted the back angle to be a little bit more of an angle. It feels nice and snug around my sides now. I like that. I adjusted the front in slightly and a little bit more of an angle as well. The bottom is still kind of on the loose side, but I'm not sure that's really terribly important. I might try to take it in slightly. It might also be the fact that my buckle is not super tight. Let's see if I can adjust that slightly. Oh, there it is. Nope, this is good. And then like it's snug across here. It gets holding everything. It's actually giving a little bit of hold and lift. It feels pretty comfortable. It doesn't feel super tight or anything, and I know I can easily loosen it up with the buckles in the front. I can make slight adjustments to that and it won't be a big deal. That's pretty spot on. The center back seam, which I can now cut away the extra from, is going to be done through the silk with a back stitch. This seems to be the way that the original was done, but to be honest, a back stitch like this, though it is fairly strong, just bothers me in terms of taking all of the tension. So I will not be doing a back stitch through the linen lining. I'll actually be whipping that seam allowance over. First though, I have to adjust the top line. At the top of the center back, it's actually cut straight across instead of up to a point. This means that I don't have to deal with all of the seam allowance up at that center point, so I'm trimming down and working the seam allowance back to where it needs to be. I will insert the straps before I stitch everything down, but for right now I'm more focused on getting that center back seam whipped over so it is extra secure and has a lot of resistance, but the whipping will be on the interior so it won't be visible, which is kind of the important part. And then I'm going to go around the bottom and finish off the edges there. This is the only part that I'm going to stitch closed before I put in the panels of the elastic or the straps at the top of the back. I just wanted to go ahead and get as much stitched up as I can before I start adding the bulky heavy parts or the straps, anything that's going to make it a little bit more troublesome to manage. awesome. This is so cool. I love it. Okay, I just have to like start putting everything together and doing the fancy stitch. Ugh.